Okay, everybody, I'm here today and we're going to just talk about Macbeth and A Christmas Carol because obviously that is your exam tomorrow. The first thing that I just want to say is that if you want help with the storyline of Macbeth or A Christmas Carol, it's better that you look at one of my other live streams, or maybe you look at some of the Mr. Bruff stuff, or indeed just reread your revision guide. And the reason why is because I don't want to spend loads of time now wasting people's time re-talking about the storyline, which is essentially AO1, what happens and why it happens. What I really want to focus on is what people keep getting wrong, and that'll be in class and indeed in like PPEs and things like that. And that is the focus on AO2 and AO3, and that's often where people go wrong. So like the vast majority of people know the storyline of A Christmas Carol and know Macbeth. If you don't, I suggest you either watch the movie tonight or watch one of my previous live streams, and that will go through the storyline as what happens and why it happens. But today I'm really going to talk to you about AO2 and AO3 and the key things you could talk about so that you make sure you don't miss out those bits in the mark scheme. So first of all, I'm going to start with Macbeth. And we're going to talk about what actually it is to talk about writers' methods, because AO2 is essentially the fact that you need to talk about the play as if it's a construct. And what that means is you're really aware that Shakespeare is a writer, the characters are not real and they've been made up. And so you repeatedly have to refer to the writer. So obviously we're doing Macbeth and Christmas Carol. So you would say Shakespeare presents or Shakespeare shows or Shakespeare whatever, and the same with Dickens. So Dickens explores the idea of class through, or Dickens explores the idea of. So you need to make really, really clear that in every paragraph you are talking about what either Dickens does or what Shakespeare does, depending on which one you're talking about. So we'll start with Macbeth first, and we're going to look at AO2 and AO3. So the kind of methods that you might want to talk about for Macbeth are, so we'll begin at the start. So obviously you've got the stage directions. So in the stage directions at the very start, at 1 scene 1, it says in thunder, lightning and in rain, and that's talking about the witches. So we've got these witches and they're all together, 3 witches, and we've got a couple of methods here used by Shakespeare. So one, we've got thunder, lightning and rain. So first of all, that's a stage direction, so that is a method, and it shows you understand it's a construct, that they're not really there in the thunder, lightning and rain. So you talk about it as a stage direction. And you could talk about thunder, the fact that it would have been frightening, the fact that it's loud, the fact that it implies that nature is unhappy, and that shows that the supernatural is negative. That's the kind of method that you wanna talk about in your essay. So say like you've got an essay about the supernatural in Macbeth, or evil in Macbeth, or something like that, you would talk about the method used by Shakespeare as thunder, lightning and rain. And obviously you can do all the connotations of those things, but you must talk about it as a stage direction because it's quite clearly in the stage directions. Another thing that you could talk about, if you wanted to do AO2 methods, which is to do with the witches, is you could talk about their name. So they were called the Weird Sisters, and weird at the time meant fate, and so you could argue that Shakespeare deliberately calls them the Weird Sisters for to create ambiguity. Number one, because they are weird, as in unusual, but also number two, because they are weird meant fate at the time. So that would be a really, really good a good thing to do. So talk about individual words that have been chosen by the writer, or stage directions, or any other methods. So that's about symbolism. So if we carry on, we could talk about also the fact that there are 3 weird sisters. Now, at the time, so this would get you AO2 marks and it would get you AO3 marks. At the time, people were quite suspicious in Elizabethan times about the number 3, and they thought that it did something difficult or something negative. And so it's kind of like I guess a superstition about the number 3. So you could easily write about the fact that actually the witches are come in a group of 3, and that's deliberate method chosen by Shakespeare to create an underlying sense of nervousness, because 3 was a number that people were suspicious about and they thought was negative. And what that says when you write that stuff like that is it says, by the way, examiner, I know that it's a construct, I know that the play is made up, and I know that deliberately he's done things to try to manipulate the reader or the audience. Okay, so then you would probably move on from the witches. You might not get asked about the witches, although I think that really might come up, but I don't know because I haven't seen the paper, obviously. So early on in the play, we get an exposition sequence. So if you talk about exposition and you use the word exposition, again, that would be an AO2 method. And you can talk about that it describes Macbeth as a brave warrior, and it talks about him chopping a man from the nave to the chaps, and it also talks about him beheading a man. Now, there are a couple of things you could do for the methods there. So you might talk about one, the bookending. So it begins with a beheading. Of Macbeth beheading someone who's fighting against Scotland, and it also ends with a beheading, which is of course Macbeth's beheading. Now, you could argue that that cyclical structure, or that book ending, is a method used by Shakespeare, so it's a structural method, but any method, and it's deliberately done to show that if you betray the king, or if you go against Scotland, or indeed the United Kingdom, that you will fail and that you will end up dead. And that would make a lot of sense, because if you want to link it into AO3, King James I, who was the king at the time, had several attempts on his life, and the one that is most commonly talked about, and the one that you will know about, is the Gunpowder Plot. And so you would have experienced the Gunpowder Plot for your whole life, because of course you would have gone to bonfire night and burning the guy. But that's because the Catholics had plotted to kill James. So it makes sense then that Shakespeare deliberately puts in the idea into his play, because he's a bit sycophantic. If you kill the king, or if you go against the king, or you commit treason, you'll end up beheaded, which is why it starts with a beheading, and it ends in a beheading, arguably. Now, what you've got to remember is that there aren't any facts, because Shakespeare lived like hundreds of years ago. Nobody actually knows what he was trying to do. But what you've got to make sure you do is you pick out something that he did, like the book ending, or like the exposition sequence, saying Macbeth is great and he's a hero, to celebrate violence when you're fighting for your country and it's patriotic. What you've got to do is pick out those kind of things, and then talk about what effect they have, or what arguable effect they have. And you can say, and you can begin sentences like, arguably Shakespeare was saying, or arguably Shakespeare wanted to promote. And then that way, what it makes it seem like is you understand that it's a construct, you understand that it's made up. You're also talking about AO2 stuff, but you recognize that it's arguable, and that it isn't just a straightforward fact. And it's important that you do that again with AO3 as well. So one of the things that kids do a lot, and it does my head right in, is they say things like, "Oh, everyone was a Christian at the time." It's like, well, they weren't though. So it's important that you say things like, predominantly Shakespeare's contemporaries were Christians, or whatever. There was a large belief in witchcraft in Elizabethan times, rather than saying everyone believed in witches, because that just isn't a fact, and it makes you sound less intelligent if you don't understand that there's nuance there. So some other things that Shakespeare uses as AO2 methods that might be interesting to you are things like, so if we're talking about Macduff, the fact that he repeatedly refers to his children as chickens and little chicks, because that emphasizes how young they are, and how little they are, and how vulnerable and innocent they are. And of course, that makes it worse that Macbeth has them killed. Far, far worse, because they seem so little. Another lovely device that you can talk about, and this is right, pretty much any essay that you get, you can absolutely talk about this as a method, is right, two things. So the death of King Duncan happens off stage. That is a method, and it's a deliberate method by Shakespeare. Why? Because it emphasizes the fact that it is so horrible and so abhorrent that you couldn't show it on stage. It also kind of emphasizes how cowardly it is that Macbeth does it, because he does it when he's asleep. So they don't show this act, or Shakespeare doesn't show this act, and it's deliberate method to show it off stage. And it really is because regicide at the time would have been deemed to be such a horrible act that they wouldn't really have wanted to show it on stage. It's kind of like now there are certain things you wouldn't show at the cinema, even in 18. It's kind of like that. And what I would say is that when you're talking about the death of Duncan, which is central to pretty much any question you get, whether or not you get one on the witches, or one on Macbeth, or even you get one on Macduff, which would be quite a difficult question, you can talk about the King Duncan being killed. And if you talk about that, I would really, really recommend that you use the word regicide. And regicide just means the killing of the king. So that's a nice one to do. Equally, if you're talking about that regicide, there's a lovely method you can use, and it's so easy to remember, is when Macduff finds the king, he repeats, so repetition is a method, horror, horror, horror. And again, that allows you to talk about his absolute shock and the fact that he thinks it is horrific because it's the worst act ever. Why? Because then you link it into context and you say, well, people believed in the divine right of kings. They believed that the king was God's representative on earth. And so for him to be murdered, particularly murdered in his sleep, really is the worst thing that can happen, because it's like killing faith and killing hope. And that's why the nature is so bad. Some people have asked about whether or not it is likely that the question will be about Lady Macbeth and her relationship with Macbeth. It depends what board you're doing. If you are doing AQA, I think that is an unlikely question. It might be up, but the reason I think it's unlikely is because the Sams 3 is about Lady Macbeth's marriage with Macbeth. And so I think it would be unlikely for them to release a Sams that was about the marriage between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and then do a question directly after, but they might. And so you just can't guess, because essentially there's only certain things they could ask. I think it is likely that they will do the supernatural or witches. They could do something about loyalty, which essentially would lead to you writing about Macbeth. Lots of the theme questions will lead to you writing about Macbeth. Okay, so let's look at other methods or other things that might be helpful to you during the play. I guess if you were gonna talk about the witches, you might want to, if you wanted to be really smart, and this really is reserved for those students who are trying to get grade 7 or above, you might want to talk about the witches being like Catholics and like equivocators, because at the time, obviously, James's kind of regime were going after the Catholics, and so lots of Catholics felt they had to lie about their religion, but they didn't want to lie about their religion, and so they equivocated, which means they lied like the truth. Now, you could argue that the witches, in some respects, are linked to the Catholics in that way, because he presents them as equivocating, they lie like the truth. And the way that they do that, this equivocation, is they say things like, you won't die until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane. So it sounds like it's impossible, but it isn't impossible. Some people have asked me what the best quotes are. Well, of course, the best quotes kind of depend on the question you get, but I do think there are some that you can always use. So at the beginning, Macbeth is described as brave Macbeth, and he's described as valiant cousin. I think that they're quite positive quotes, quite easy to remember, that help really emphasize how good Macbeth is deemed to be at the very beginning. If you want to do something about the witches, thunder, lightning, and rain are the most obvious ones to do. If you want to look at Lady Macbeth, I guess the most obvious quote about her is about her dashing her baby's brains out. I just want to talk a little bit about Lady Macbeth, actually. So if you're doing methods or context for Lady Macbeth, it is important, firstly, to understanding that the role of women in a patriarchal society. So a patriarchal society is a society that was largely or predominantly ruled by men, and where women are essentially a bit subservient. Now, predominantly, their role at that time, well done, it is pathetic fallacy. Whoever just said that, thunder and lightning and rain, is pathetic fallacy. Yeah, predominantly the role of women at that time was to keep the home and to make children, essentially. Now, some people argue that Lady Macbeth did have a child at some point, which is why she's got milk in her breasts, and she says, "Well, come take my milk for gall." Other people say that that is a fiction and that she never had a child. What is important, and I think that this is a really important method, is the irony of the fact that Macbeth tries to kill Banquo and Banquo's son Fleance, bearing in mind that he's fought with Banquo and spent a lot of time with Banquo. There's a real irony in him doing that, because his sons can't be king. Why? Because he doesn't have any. So there's a real kind of futility, that means pointlessness, in him ever doing that. It doesn't make any sense for him to have done it, and yet that's what he does. And I think that shows how warped he's become. Another thing that is worth talking about, if you want to do methods, and if you don't do methods, by the way, you're going to lose 2/5 of your marks. You have to talk about methods. Oh, by the way, I can't do sign of 4. I haven't even read it, so I'm really sorry, I can't do it. is the fact that it is a Greek tragedy, essentially. So this play follows the rules of a Greek tragedy. So Greek tragedies were tragedy plays that were done way before Shakespeare, and you don't really need to know the literary heritage. They didn't. I guess the key things that you'd need to know about it is one, that they come in 5 acts, and that they have a tragic hero, and that tragic hero is a person who is in power and in control, and usually is quite a positive character, just like Macbeth is at the start, because he's got his brave Macbeth, etc. And he's a hero, and then something happens. It's usually the catalyst, and the witches are the catalyst here. It's usually the catalyst, and the catalyst triggers their hamartia, or you can call it their fatal flaw, either way. And a fatal flaw is essentially something that's wrong with you, something that's bad with you, that leads to you where you're gonna die, because it means fatal flaw, yeah. So it just is a flaw that's going to cause your death. And essentially, the witches trigger his fatal flaw, so he is a tragic hero in that respect. And then slowly it gets worse and worse and worse and worse until just before he dies. And then he has his anagnorisis, or anagnorisis, that's how you pronounce it. I can never pronounce that. It's a realization just before the end that he's been tricked by the witches, and that again is classic of a Greek hero. So he has got this classic kind of Greek hero thing going on, and you can definitely talk about that, and that would get you a lot of marks for context, because it shows that you understand literary context. So I guess they're the key things I would talk about really for context in Macbeth. And in terms of methods as well, I've kind of talked about some of the key ones that I would use. You could talk about any symbolism at all. So if you talk about things being symbolic, or motifs, so that's a repeated image, so light and dark, or not looking like you should, so be the innocent, look like the innocent flower but be the serpent under it, that kind of thing, or there are daggers in men's smiles. So their motifs, repeated images or repeated ideas, they will get you lots and lots of marks for AO2. I will take questions at the end of this. So what I'm going to look at now is A Christmas Carol. Again, what I would say is if you need the storyline of A Christmas Carol, watch one of my other live streams, or watch some Mr. Bruff or whatever else to get the storyline. But from me, what you're going to get is what kind of AO2 things and kind of AO3 things could you be looking out for. So I guess the first thing for A Christmas Carol for AO2 is that you could talk about the exposition sequence at the start, and about how it shows immediately, it establishes Scrooge as a character who's quite selfish and greedy, the fact that he won't give the coal. But what's important is that you'd have to say, to make it sound like an AO2 method, you'd have to say, in Dickens's exposition sequence, or at the beginning, Dickens uses exposition to show, so you make it really clear that it's something Dickens is doing to show something, and that's the important thing about AO2, and then you talk about the effect. So obviously it establishes Dickens as a really, no, so it doesn't establish, sorry, it doesn't establish Dickens, it establishes Scrooge as a really negative character at the start, because he won't give Bob coal. And also another thing that you could talk about at the start in the exposition sequence, and this again would be a method, AO2, is that you would say, Dickens creates him, exposition just, sorry, someone's just asked a question. Exposition just means where you expose or give information. So at the beginning of almost all text, you get exposition, and that's where you tell the reader or the audience information, and that can be counted as a method. So it's a structural method. Almost always happens at the start. The other thing with the beginning in the exposition sequence is the way that he describes Scrooge as an archetypal villain. And a good example of that is the fact that he has these red eyes, the pointed nose, the thin blue lips, and all of those things deliberately make him seem like a negative character, as if he's kind of like caricatured. So he's like an exaggerated baddie version, and particularly you could talk about the word red and the red eyes, and that, you know, the eyes are supposed to be the doorway to the soul, and then when you look at them, they're red, and that you could associate that with the devil and evil and danger, and all of those things that you could get from Scrooge at the start. I think other things that you could talk about would be in all of the ghosts. So the ghosts are really good to talk about if you want to talk about symbolism. If you talk about symbolism, one, it feels like it lifts your answer to a higher level, but also immediately again it's AO2. So if you're talking about the Ghost of Christmas past, and you've got the candle and the light, you might talk about the fact that it's symbolic of hope. Or you, and this is an argument, yeah, so you can argue whatever you like. So you could say it is symbolic of sorry, I've just got a notification that's come up. You could say that it is symbolic of enlightenment and redemption. It's definitely important that you talk about redemption in A Christmas Carol. So those are the kind of things that we'll talk about. So you need to look at each of the features of the ghosts and why they're used, and then you can say what they're symbolic of. So they're symbolic of hope, or they're symbolic of truth, or they're symbolic of redemption, or getting to know your past, or whatever. And you can talk about that with the Ghost of Christmas Present too. Now, nomenclature is really interesting. Some of you won't have a clue what nomenclature is. So to be clear, nomenclature is the naming of things. If you can't remember that, just say the names that Dickens uses. That's important because the Ghost of Christmas Present, of course, is wordplay, or you could say it's ambiguous. And a good example of that is that it's the Ghost of Christmas Present as in now, and there's lots of jokes about the fact that he's got so many brothers because obviously he's only alive for now. But what's important is that his name is also a present, as in a gift, and there's a real message there. You could say that he's symbolic of making the most of the present and making the most of now, and that you are given a present by the present, and that you have the ability to give presents by being kind and by being generous and by engaging with your family, for example, like Fred. Another really lovely method used by Dickens is the deliberate juxtaposing of Fred and the philanthropists, they're the charity men, with Scrooge, because Scrooge is this big, mean, horrible character who won't even let a guy have any coal, in comparison to Fred, who comes in and is warm and invites him to his house, and that serves, there's a deliberate reason that they've done that juxtaposing, and it's because, or that Dickens has done that juxtaposing, it's because he's deliberately tried to emphasize how bad Scrooge is by showing him against other nice characters. So that's an important method that's been used there. There are loads and loads of other methods. I think that the most obvious ones probably will be the names. So I guess you've got the name Scrooge, which sounds like Scrounge. That's an important one because it kind of emphasizes that Scrooge, even in his name, is really stiggy is not a word you use nowadays, but scrounging and ungenerous and greedy, and yet he has the capacity to change. Now, I think that what's important there is that Dickens is saying, just so you know, if even Scrooge can change, then you can all change. And that's kind of why the book is set when it is. It's a moral story about Christmas. Yeah, the video will be saved on YouTube, so you can just watch it straight afterwards, whoever you are, Dauntless. So I think what's important is that you really get a grasp of the fact that the whole book is about Christmas, and it's about a Christmas lesson. Now, for context, this will be important. So this is AO3, for example. You might want to talk about the fact that it would have been expected that people would sit around the fire with their family and perhaps read a story. People really liked, ghost stories were really popular, but people liked reading around the fireside as a family. And we've also got the important context of the fact that predominantly people were Christian at the time, and so there's a sense of the Christian values of Christmas, of giving and of philanthropy, and of being kind and generous to your neighbour, which of course is kind of what Christian sentiment is supposed to be about. Other things that might be important in terms of context are Tiny Tim's a great example. Now, his nomenclature is important too because he's Tiny and Tim. That alliterative name with the TT makes him almost sound cute and like a cartoon character. It immediately makes him a likable, sweet, childlike character. But also, tiny, the adjective tiny to describe him kind of emphasizes his vulnerability. But if you're looking at context with regard to him, that they didn't have a national health service and they didn't have free healthcare or medicine and things, and so he may well have been essentially left to die if Scrooge hadn't have helped. And I think that's an important point because when Dickens was writing, they didn't have the kind of universal healthcare that we've got at the moment. And so those kind of people who were disabled for whatever reason, and you never really get to know the reasons, may well have been left to die. And so that's kind of why he talks about the surplus population, because again, we get this sense that you don't want Tiny Tim to die, but if Tiny Tim's not going to die, something has to change with society. It's important that you understand, and I think this will help with an AO2 point as well, that the whole point of the book is a message to society about being generous and about changing. And therefore, Scrooge is symbolic of society and symbolic of the change that needs to happen in society. It's really important that you grasp that. That's the whole point of the book. And the ghosts are the way in which he gets to that redemption. And of course, him changing leads to his personal redemption, but it also is positive for everybody else as well. A few things about the context that might be relevant as well. So obviously Dickens himself was a well-known literary giant really at the time, and I guess what's important there is that he never told anyone that when he was younger he was poor. And he wasn't poor originally, but his father got in to lots of debt and went to a debtor's prison. And then Dickens was forced to work in a place where you kind of black shoes, I guess is the best way that you would understand it. So like shoe polish, that kind of thing, in a factory when he was a child. And so suddenly he was plunged into deep poverty. So his ability to empathize is high. He understands what it's like to be poor. And actually, poor people didn't really feature in very many books at the time. And so he deliberately wanted to expose what it was like to be poor. And noticeably, he presents the poor as positive rather than as negative. And that wasn't always the case at the time when they were in it. So I don't know if anyone's got any actually sensible questions that they want to ask that they're worried about. And if you do, you can type them now and I will endeavour to answer them, and then I'm going to go and eat my dinner. Right, how would you approach a theme or character question structurally? I guess for me, I might talk about the exposition sequence. So with Macbeth, I would talk about at the beginning, about how he's presented as such a hero, and talk about that as an exposition sequence, and then how that, because he's established as such a hero, how that allows for his downfall. And if it was A Christmas Carol again, how we establish Scrooge as such an archetypal villain, and then how that makes for such an extreme change at the end. I think that would be the best way to talk about that. Some people have said, can I expand on ignorance and want? Yeah, I can. A nice thing came up actually in my lesson today about the fact that ignorance and want are covered up. And I think that's a really important point about ignorance and want. So ignorance and want are symbolic of what's wrong with society, that people are ignorant, they're not well educated, and that they're in want, they are hungry and they're starving. And so you could argue that Scrooge and his like in society that are greedy in that way have created ignorance and want in society. So they're kind of symbolic, or they are a metaphorical child and they're society's children. There's a reason that they're skinny, and it's because they're supposed to represent the kind of difficulties of society and of the poor, and that's why they're presented as that. The reason that they're children is because, of course, they're symbolic of the future. If you behave in this way, Scrooge and society, this is what the future will be like. Someone asked something about him as a Greek, Macbeth as a Greek tragic hero, and I now can't see it. Sorry, it's gone off my screen. People just asked how long an introduction should be. I would argue that in your exam, You just need to answer the question and then say what you think the purpose of it is. So if you talk about the witches, how they're presented, so yeah, they're presented as evil, but why? Why are they presented as evil? And that should be your argument, so your premise, and you should then argue that throughout, and every single paragraph should support that point. Bravery in Macduff and Macbeth. Well, certainly Macbeth is brave at the start, and indeed, you could argue that Macbeth is brave to kill the king and commit regicide because it's such an abhorrent crime, and he may well be kind of forfeiting his life in heaven thereafter. Equally, you could argue it as cowardice because he does it when he's asleep. So I think you could argue that both ways. I think that they invert bravery with Macduff. This idea of masculinity with Macduff, the fact that he gets really upset when his children and his wife are dead, I think that that's really important because it shows that you don't have to be this archetypal male, which is just a typical male, that you can be sensitive and care as well. Lots of people have talked about whether minor characters will come up. You could get Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, Banquo, Macduff. I will be surprised if any other characters come up, to be honest. You could get any theme, literally any theme for Macbeth, but most themes you'd be able to do through Macbeth. And so if you haven't watched my revision video, that's the little animation, it's about 6.5 minutes on Macbeth, I would watch that because it's got some key quotations and things. Other things that people are asking, how can you link Dickens's dad in? I guess it's about his ability to empathise with the poor. So the whole point is that he put a focus on the poor when lots of people weren't focusing on the poor, and he wanted to tell their story. And so I think that that would be important. The reason he wanted to do that is because he had empathy with the poor in a way that lots of other people writing didn't. So people have asked what my predictions are. I think that the supernatural will come up in Macbeth. And in A Christmas Carol, I don't think they'll do supernatural on both of them, though it's likely that it will be in one of them, in my opinion. In A Christmas Carol, I think you might get loneliness, but I genuinely don't know. It won't be the Cratchit showing the struggle of the poor, definitely, because that was a question last year. So it's just not going to be that. I'm going to go now, and if you want to ask me questions, I'm going to eat my dinner. If you want to ask me questions, I am going to be on Twitter later. And the other thing is, yeah, I won't reply to YouTube video comments, so I don't even know how to do that. So if you want to talk to me and you want a question answered, talk to me on Twitter. I'm going to eat my dinner, and then I am going to make my students lucky socks. Okay, really wish you all the best of luck tomorrow. Please don't hesitate to ask me any questions, and I will see you later. Good luck.